This is Warren Vanderhill, Muncie Jewish Oral History Project, Interview 3. I'm speaking with Sherman Zeigler in his home in Muncie, Indiana. Sherman, I wonder if you could start our conversation this evening by telling me some things about your father, how your father happened to come to this country, even more importantly, I suppose, his background in the old country.
Well, my father arrived here when he was about 24, and one of the basic purposes in his leaving Lithuania, which was then under the rule of Russia, was to escape being drafted into the Russian army. The Russian army was a real hell for Jews in that they couldn't rise above enlisted ranks. They were usually delegated to the cleaning of the latrines, and they were always the butt of other soldiers' dislike and their nefarious activities. And so he felt that it was necessary that he leave and come to a country where there was opportunity. He had an uncle who was my great uncle who had settled in Anderson, Indiana, and he was in the scrap business there, and he financed my father's trip to this country and to Anderson. The purpose of this was to gather the family together, plus the fact that in those days, the basis before this area of the country was so highly industrialized, the basis of a successful scrap business was to have satellites with this was before the day of trucks, to have satellites with a horse and wagon who'd go through the countryside and buy scrap and bring it to a central location and ship it from the central location into Anderson, Indiana, where it was prepared and then sold and shipped to the steel mills. And my father was financed to a horse and wagon, and he toured the area around Osgood as far as Versailles, Indiana. Couldn't go any further than Versailles because the horse with the loaded wagon couldn't pull the hills. So they had to stay out of areas that were too hilly, and they operated in that part of southern Indiana buying scrap from farmers, which at that time consisted not only of scrap iron but rubber, which was really in demand and a big item, furs, bones for fertilizer, glass, all this type of thing. And this my father continued to do until he came to Muncie and established his own business in 1970.
How did he happen to come to Muncie? Why Muncie as opposed to some other place?
Well, he had a brother who the same uncle brought to Anderson, who he peddled with on the horse and wagon. They, as is many cases, they didn't get on too well, so they separated company and partnership, and the brother came to Muncie, Indiana, which at that time had one scrap dealer who was beginning to age, and after being here for a short time, he again approached my father and told him that things would be different, that there was a great opportunity in Muncie, and wondered if he wouldn't come with him and form a firm with him. And this my father did, and they were together for a short time and again parted company, and then my father started his own business, which was I believe in 1916.
Did your father learn to speak English when he came here?
Yes, my father spoke no English, and he did learn to speak English. When he came here, incidentally, he developed a great vocabulary. He never learned, as far as the fine points of American grammar. He never perfected that, though he did handle the language well, but had a fantastic use of words. He attended night school for a while in Indianapolis, and there was where he got his basic. That's where he actually trained in a basic way in the English language.
When were you born?
I was born in 1921. I was born in Muncie, Indiana, on what is now the Ball State campus, where the Student Center is.
Proper location.
Proper location. Right next to the Pine Shelf.
Could you give me some information about your background, education, and how you happened to become involved with the business?
Well, growing up on campus, which we were practically on, we were just across the street from the main building, was quite an experience in itself. There was always excitement. My family never owned a car. Neither one of my parents ever learned to drive, and my family never owned a car. So the Ball State homecoming at that time was a great experience, and the climbing of the greased pole was a great experience. The football games were great experiences. Instead of going in through the gate, naturally, we went over the fence. The activity of all the BTOs on campus were interesting to watch, and naturally is. I grew a little older. The girls were enjoyable to watch too, and the students and the faculty were always very nice. They were always friendly. The students were always fun to be with. There was a restaurant called the Pine Shelf, which I lived next door to, and it was an interesting operation to watch. This is where some of the bootleg hooch was consumed at that time in Ball State's history, and this was a time when there was no smoking allowed on campus, and we watched some of the lovemaking that took place among the Ball State students, and it was just an exciting time and an exciting location to grow up in.
Did you receive your education here in Muncie?
I graduated from Burris School, entered the Navy, and then while I was in the Navy, I was put in an officers group to train as a line officer, and was sent to Berea College at Berea, Kentucky, and then it was decided that the Navy wanted me to become a supply officer, where I could use to good effect what experience I'd had in the scrap business. So I was sent to the University of North Carolina, and that's where I received my education, Berea College and University of North Carolina.
So you came back to Muncie after World War II?
I came back to Muncie after World War II. That was after being practically every part of the United States during the war. That was a basic decision that I had to make. My experience in the scrap business, which I had during summers. I'd worked in the scrapyard ever since I was 12 years old, and my experience in the scrap business was one which I enjoyed. The business always fascinated me, and I decided that Muncie was a right-sized town. And my parents lived here, who I wanted to be near, and I felt that I had a future in the scrap business, which I felt in turn had a future in Muncie. The scrap business had a future in Muncie.
What were the occupations of most of the people in the Jewish community while you've been in Muncie?
Mostly small businesses. I don't recall any Jewish teachers. I don't recall any Jewish professors at the time. I know as I grew up as a boy, it was even difficult for a Jew to get a job at an industrial plant. If a non-Jew's application was there, the Jew was passed over. I don't know of any Jewish industrial workers. The Jew mainly was in ownership capacity in small businesses, clothing stores, Greeks had the candy stores. Clothing stores, he was either owner or he managed a store for a chain. Maybe he had a little grocery store. Mostly small businesses. I think there was one Jewish lawyer here at the time with one of the larger law firms, and but it was mainly in business and probably a few professionals.
Looking both at your father's generation and your generation, what kind of social life did the Jews have in Muncie?
Very restricted. It was a very restrictive social life. The social aspect of the association as a Jew was mostly with other Jews. It was rarely with Gentiles. Oh, he was invited to join the United Fund in their planned meetings for collection of funds. He was invited to the C of C yearly meetings, and but as far as social associations, he couldn't belong to the country club, couldn't belong to the Muncie club, couldn't even belong to the Elks. I think the Moose was open to him. I think one or two Jews did belong to the Moose, but most of the social clubs and the civic clubs also were closed to the Jew.
Were the members of the Jewish community involved much at all then in the community life? If you were to look back on your father's generation, I know you talked to me a bit before we began our recording here this evening about the changes that we'll get to later that have been almost monumental as far as your generation is concerned, and particularly in the last decade or two. But in your father's generation, were there many Jews involved in the community life?
No, there were not, and of course this wasn't altogether by choice, but it didn't really affect the Jew as deeply as you'd think that it would, in that he was busy making it. He was busy working 12, 14 hours a day, 15 hours a day, making it so that his kids could get a college education, which was uppermost in the Jewish fathers and mothers' mind. This was basic. It was besides health, this was the second most important thing, health being first. It was important that the children get a college education at a good school, at a well-accepted school, so that they could rise above the opportunities that their parents had.
Focusing more on your generation now, what was the relationship between Jews and non-Jews as you were growing up?
As I was growing up? Well, I was fortunate in that I went to Burris School. And Burris School was, there were mostly middle class and upper middle class and wealthy children that went to Burris. And they were well-mannered by and large. Though there was no doubt anti-Semitic feelings among them and their families, they were polite, they were cultured, and they were polite, and very rarely was there confrontation. I can remember, maybe 2 or 3 times that the confrontation did take place. I can remember specifically one bully that used to chase me home, rough me up pretty good, tear up my clothes, and he was bigger than I, and did a fair job of roughing me up. I'd go home crying, and I'd ask my mother why I did this. He'd call me a damn Jew and a Christ killer, and I'd ask my mother why I did this, and she told me he's just jealous. He knows you're better than he is, and he's just jealous. Well, as I grew up and realized that someday I'd be married and I'd have a family, and if this ever happened to my kids, what could I tell them? I knew that wasn't so when my mother told me that. She just told me that to make me feel good, and I always wondered what I would tell my kids when they grew up and asked me that question. Are you interested in an incident that did take place?
Yeah, I
with my
definitely
kids?
am, because I think that one point that we should definitely get on here would be anti-Semitic incidents that are of consequence in your life and the life of your children too.
Well, as I say, first of all, I was always indebted to Burris School because of the consideration that the teachers showed me there, and also my younger sister, went to Burris School. The respect that they gave my family, and the good feeling of the kids there. And I was always thankful that I lived in Normal City, and that's where I went to school. However, as I say, there was some anti-Semitism, and I will tell you a little later about some anti-Semitism that I ran into in job hunting and then in building a home. But I married, and I had 2 boys, and I lived in practically the same neighborhood that I grew up in. I raised my family in a home on Hawthorne Drive, which is just a little bit west of Normal City. My sons went to Westview School and to Storer School, and then to North. And of course, Westview, close by Burris, and similar culture existed in Westview and Storer that existed in Burris. But as my boys grew up and they experienced the give and take that kids have in school, my kids were always aware of their Jewish father, though their mother wasn't Jewish. They were always aware of their Jewish father. They were always aware of his feeling toward Judaism, not a religious Judaism, but a philosophical one. And they never came home roughed up. They never came home and told their dad that the fellows called them damn Jews. Why? And one evening, my wife and I it was supper time, and the boys hadn't returned, and we were waiting on the boys, wondering where they were. They came in late and washed up and sat down at the supper table, and we asked them where they were. And they said, well, they were at the bridge. And I said, what do you mean at the bridge? Well, they were at a challenge at the bridge. I said, what kind of a challenge at the bridge? And they said, well, Perry Cross's son had challenged another boy at the bridge because he'd insulted his aunt. And they said they stayed to see the fight. So here's my opportunity. And I said, fellas, have other fellas ever picked on you, fellas? Called you damn Jews and called you Christ killers? And both of them laughed. And of course I resented the fact that they should laugh at this. This was a very serious subject with me. And I said, fellas, what are you laughing about? And their reaction together, much as the laughter, well, why should they do that? It was completely foreign to them. They hadn't heard it, and they couldn't imagine my asking a question like that. Now I realize that's pretty simplified, and I realize that it probably happens in our neighborhood, but it amazed me that one of my boys at this time was 11 and one was 13, and they had not run into this in the same Normal City that I used to get roughed up in.
Do you think that's generational?
Well, it's possible, but it just shows you, to me, it shows you a change in attitude and a change in thinking of the country. I think much as a result of the war and many of the soldiers going all over the world, and we weren't as insulated as we once were, and as a result, the soldiers. The servicemen saw many religions and saw many nationalities, and so the differences didn't make that much difference to them.
You briefly alluded to your own life then, and some incidents of discrimination and anti-Semitism that have been important in your own career here in Muncie. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about these instances.
Well, there were two specific instances that I'll take time to tell about because they were of basic impact. And one was when I was 12 years old. A friend of mine who wanted to carry a paper route, and myself applied to the Muncie Press circulation department to get a route. There was a route open in my own neighborhood, the neighborhood that I lived in. And they told us they'd let us know in a few days. And, of course, I was super anxious, 12 years old, wanted to earn my own money and carry a paper route, which seemed to me to be a thrilling occupation at that age. And I didn't hear from him. So I ran into this young man who I applied with, and I asked him if he'd heard from him. He said, yes. And I said, well, what'd they say? And he says, well, I got the route. And I said, well, I haven't heard from him. Am I going to get it? Did they say anything about me? And I could tell by the way he acted that he had something he wasn't telling me. And I told him, Bob, now be honest with me. Am I going to get this job or not? And he says, well, if you promise not to say anything about it, I'll tell you. And I said, I won't say anything about it. And he says, well, you're not going to get it. And I said, well, why? I suspected why at the time. And I said, well, why? He said, because they didn't want any Jews working on their paper. And I was only 12 years old, and that came as quite a shock, though it wasn't totally unexpected. And I was heartbroken, and I went home and told my father about it, who I could tell was heartbroken, too, because he didn't want to see that happen to his children, to his son. Thought it was a little young age. Didn't say anything to me about it, but about 3 days later, the circulation manager of the newspaper, plus the publisher of the newspaper, called and asked if they could talk with my father and myself, and my father told them yes. And they came out to the house, and they said that there was a misunderstanding. The publisher of the paper said he was Catholic himself, and he would never think of restricting anyone because of religion. And he said there was a misunderstanding, and he apologized, and the circulation manager said that he was misunderstood, and that if I still wanted the job, it was mine. Well, what I didn't know was that my father had told this to several of his Jewish friends who had stores on Walnut Street, and at that time the Muncie Star and Muncie Evening Press were different companies, and when the Muncie Press solicited these merchants for their ads, they said, you don't give Jews jobs, we don't give you ads. So it was an economic thing, and they did come to us and offered me the job on a platter. My parents didn't want me to take it because of their pride, but I wanted it so bad. I took it, and incidentally, I increased my route by more new customers than any other carrier that they had on the Star, which was a natural reaction, I guess. The second incident happened when I came back from the service, and I'd been back a couple of years and married. My wife and I picked out a location. We picked out a house. We'd been looking in magazines that showed different plans of homes, and we picked out a house that we wanted. And in riding around the area, we picked out a lot that we thought this house would fit perfectly in among the trees on this lot. The lot was on Petty Road. We knew that there were restrictions in Westwood and in Kenmore, and I was just starting the business and certainly didn't want to offend anybody and rock the boat. And we did find a lot in Man Addition, which was just opposite of Westwood. And my wife at that time worked as a legal secretary in a law firm here. And the real estate man that had this lot was the same. It was a fellow by the name of Swain. The addition was platted by a gentleman by the name of Tom Mann. Well, before purchasing the lot, agreeing to purchase the lot, I asked the real estate man, Mr. Swain, who was really a very nice person, is this area restricted? I specifically said we don't want to offend anyone, we don't want to create a hassle, but we don't want to go ahead and make plans if this area is restricted. He said, I anticipated that question, and I made inquiry of the gentleman who platted the addition. And he said that the only restriction was that you be good neighbors. He knew both you and your wife, and the area was not restricted and saw no reason why you couldn't build there. So at this time, we made the down payment on the lot and purchased the lot. Well, about 2 weeks after that, a non-Jewish friend of my father's said, Ben, he said, I was in the bank this morning and your son isn't making friends in the community. And my dad says, how's that? And he says, well, he bought a lot in restricted edition. He's going to build a home. And my father told me this, and he was really, really very emotional about it when he told me this. And I told him there must be a mistake, because we did make inquiry, and let me double check. So went to Swain, the real estate man, old line real estate man, old timer in Muncie, and asked him again, and told him what happened, told him the man's name, would give my father this information at the bank. And Swain says, I can't understand that. He says, when I made the original inquiry, he said, they told me the only restriction was that you be good neighbors. And he says, now it also led back to me that it is restricted and you're not allowed to build there. And I told him, well, Swain, I said, I could, Mr. Swain, I could make an issue of it, but I don't choose to, because I certainly don't want to live where I'm not wanted, but I would like my down payment back. And he says, you will get it. I waited 30 days and didn't receive the down payment. And I waited 60 days and didn't receive the down payment. I contacted Mr. Swain again, asked him about it, and he said, please give me a little longer. He said, when you made that down payment, I invested it in another project, and I haven't been able to retrieve it yet, but be patient. So I decided at that time that if I didn't get it back in another 15 days, that I was going to the law firm, of which my wife was a secretary, which was one of the law firms that was very influential in enforcing these restrictions in these plats, in these editions. And I did not receive the check within 15 days. And I went up to one of the leading attorneys in this law firm and told him I'd like to file suit. And he said, against who? And I told him and gave him the details. And he said, why, certainly, I don't blame you a bit. We'll institute suit immediately. And the next day I had a check in full for the down payment. Those were really the two incidents in my life that had the greatest impact.
Mm-hmm. Was there any problems that your dad had that he might have mentioned to you regarding Klan activity? Because that's come up in a number of the conversations I've had with people.
Well, yes. Of course, since my parents weren't involved socially in the community, the effect would be one. It'd be a financial effect, and there were many people who, that belonged to the Klan, who only would deal with other Klan members. However, there were quite a large group of businessmen in the community who were Catholic, and they sort of cleaved together. And for instance, there were automobile wreckers in town who my father bought scrap from, who were Catholics, and who would only sell their scrap to a Jew. And at that time, as I say, the Klan was ultra selective, and they excluded Catholics as well as Jews. Muncie had a fairly large Catholic community, so the boycott which they tried to effect wasn't as effective, or didn't create the economic pressure that you would expect, had there been no Catholics in the community.
Was your family very religious?
I was never confirmed. I never had my bar mitzvah. Never had a religious education as far as the temple was concerned. But my dad was very religious, philosophical. In fact, my dad in the old country studied to be a Jewish rabbi, and he rebelled against it. as a young man, and but he was very well learned in Jewish history, Jewish religion, Jewish background. Of course, as I grew up, a lot of this was passed on to me, and my values and my moral values were based upon the religion, the philosophical aspect of the religion, which really isn't all that much different from any other religion.
Did your father belong to the religious congregation here?
No, he did not. No,
do you belong to the congregation?
No, I never have.
Was Zionism of any importance in your family's life?
Oh, yes. My father.
Sherman, we're talking about the importance of Zionism in your father's life. I'd like you to continue on that point.
My father was always a very ardent Zionist. I heard Zionism as I grew up. It wasn't preached to me, but my father was an ardent reader. He enjoyed books, almost worshipped books. Read all the time, and one of his specialties were books on Zionism, and so that was part of my background. And I myself am a Zionist. I'm not ardent, but I contribute to the cause. I think Israel is very important. I think it's important for the preservation of Jewish culture, and probably subconsciously I feel, as most other Jews feel, that in case we should see a repeat performance of the German situation here, we'd have a place to run. The Jews in Europe had no place to run except the gas chambers, and probably subconsciously one of the reasons for the support of Zionism and for Israel is that there would be doors that would be open to us.
You mentioned before we began our taping this evening that you don't think that Jews can ever be secure, that they always, to use a kind of contemporary cliche, have to be conscious of looking over their shoulders. I wonder if you'd elaborate a bit on that stance.
Well, our historical experience, I think, bears this feeling of insecurity out. We experienced a golden age in Spain, contributed so much in Spanish philosophy, Spanish government, the financing, the New World, exploration of the New World, and so forth. And yet came the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, which was one of the harshest, most brutal things that ever happened to the Jew. It was different than what happened in Germany, in that the Jew was given a choice to convert or be burned. In Germany, there was no choice. It would just be burned. But then, after the Inquisition, along comes Hitler and Germany. And keep in mind that the Jew in Germany was the most assimilated Jew in all of Europe. And he'd reached heights in science and music, philosophy, that were unequaled in education, you name it. He'd reached those heights in Germany. And as I say, he was one of the most assimilated Jews in the world at that time. I think that probably in the area of 40% of the German marriages at that time were to non-Jews. And yet, when the boom fell, it fell hardest there of any place in the world. So he had no security there. And even though in the United States we've arrived at what is really the golden age, opportunity is unequaled. The heights that the Jew has reached here has even surpassed what he had reached in Germany and Spain, because of the opportunity, and the equality that he's experienced here has never been equaled. I think now that statistics say that 50% of all the marriages in this country are intermarriages between Jew and non-Jew. And I've even read statistics that by the year 2010 there will only be 10,000 Jews left in the United States if the intermarriages continue. The reason I mention this is because this really shows the acceptance and the equality that the Jew feels that he has. But in spite of all that, because of his history, there's the insecurity what lurks in the back of his mind, and subconsciously you always wonder when you're going to need that open door.
That it might happen again.
It might happen. It could happen again.
I know you've been very active in the community, and I'd like to have you tell me some of the activities within the community that you regard as important contributions which you have made to Muncie.
Well, first of all, I think it's important that we who live in a community be part of it, participate in its betterment, contribute to this betterment, leave it a better place than it was when we came. This is one of my basic philosophies. Part of that, I think, comes from my Jewish background. Part of that comes from my schooling. But from the very beginning, I've participated as a member of committees. I think the Salvation Army was one of the boards that I first served on. Boy Scout Board, later the Community Services Council, United Fund Board, presently on a...
You mentioned the United Fund Board.
United Fund Board. Presently, I'm a member of the board of the Ball Memorial Hospital. I'm a member of the board of the one of the local savings institutions, which is the Mutual Home and Savings. But all through my business life here and my community life, I have served on various committees and boards, always contributed to causes such as Emmons Auditorium, Ball Memorial Hospital improvements, YMCA. It really attempted to be a good citizen and contribute to my community and to the welfare of citizens in my community, never from an economic point of view, or never for the purpose of bettering myself economically, but because I felt it was necessary, and because it's really part of my philosophy of life. I think you attempt to do these things through your family, you attempt to do these things through your community, through your fellow man, and through your institutions. And this I've always attempted to do to the best of my ability.
How about the university? I know you've had some important things to do there.
The university, too. The university is very close to me because, as I say, it was such a good friend of mine as I grew up practically on campus. And though I didn't attend Ball State, I did attend it for one term, but though in reality I didn't attend Ball State, I've always had an admiration for it. I've always had a feeling of warmth for it, and do contribute funds to its activities. Presently has contributed monies to a landscape fund, which will in which tree plantings will take place in and around campus for the beautification of campus and areas surrounding it. This is being handled by the architectural school. Also, my parents contributed a basic fund to a foundation there to bring speakers who represent the Jewish culture and Jewish thought, so that the students at Ball State who will go out in the world and be teachers to teach other persons' children will have some exposure to the Jewish ethic and to the Jewish culture and to the accomplishments and the contributions that the Jewish people have made. There are things of this nature that my family and myself have done all through our living in Muncie. are things I'd rather not mention because they're not public knowledge, and just as a point of being modest, it's not necessary. I feel that they become public knowledge, but these are a few things.
Well, I think they're very important ones. What do you believe to be the future of the Jewish community in Muncie?
Well, I think part of that depends on Muncie itself, and the reason I say that is if Muncie grows to the point of offering more opportunity to college-educated youth, whether they be professionals or teachers or business or whatever persuasion that not only Jewish youth but any youth follows. If those opportunities appear and exist in Muncie, I think some of those opportunities do exist at Ball State University. I think some of those opportunities exist in the medical profession, but I feel that as those opportunities appear, or those opportunities should come to exist, I feel that there are Jews that will settle in Muncie, that the youth will come back. At this point, I think many of the sons and daughters of Jewish families who leave Muncie for their education marry and settle elsewhere because they feel the opportunity is greater.
In the case of many of the Jewish people that I either have interviewed or will interview, a large percentage are from families where the business that they are now involved with is in the second generation. And I've asked this question of many of them and wish to ask it of you too. What will happen to your business, which has been a family business up to this point, in the next generation?
Well, that's a question that I don't particularly like being confronted with. I have no daughters, so as a result, no son-in-laws. I have two sons, neither one of whom are interested in the scrap business, one of whom I don't believe would fit. It's not his cup of tea. The second of whom would be ideal as a businessman, not only as a businessman, but as a businessman in the industrial scrap business. But he graduates from Brown University this June, and he wishes not to come back to Muncie and wishes not to go into business.
What does he want to do? As an academic, I'm curious.
Well, at this point, he wants to get into social work. He wants to save the world. Maybe that's part of the philosophical Judaism that he got at home. However, frankly, I feel that he's maybe carrying it a little too far. But maybe not. The choice is his. All I ask is that he be a good citizen, a good American, be decent.
Very well said. Is there anything else that you'd like to add by way of reflections on the comments you made on your life as part of the community, your parents' lives as part of this community?
I really would. And I can't stress what I'm going to say too much. As I grew up, we grew up in what in Yiddish is called a very ricious community. And by that we mean a very prejudiced and a very anti-Semitic community. In fact, Muncie was even more anti-Semitic than Anderson, and then Logansport, then Fort Wayne. The Jews a few of the Jews in Anderson and in Fort Wayne could belong to the civic clubs. The Jews were restricted from the civic clubs here. Of course, as a young man, it didn't mean anything to me, but I knew that situation existed. The Jews were restricted from the country club, so they developed their own, which never flew, and which I don't believe they really enjoyed that much. We were certainly restricted in job opportunities. This is one of the reasons that there were so many Jewish businessmen at that time, because if you weren't hired, you created your own opportunities. But this was Muncie. This was early Muncie, a very strong clan-oriented town, and even more so than, as I say, the sister communities of Anderson, Fort Wayne, Logansport, Kokomo. Muncie was an extreme. But since coming back from the service, that attitude has, I don't know whether it's gone underground or it's completely changed. My observation is that it has changed. It's a different atmosphere altogether. We're now in the civic clubs of our choice. We're accepted in the country clubs. We're accepted in the Elks, which we hadn't been. We're accepted in the Muncie Club. We have, I think, what is complete social equality, where up to World War II we had no social equality. I'm not naive enough to think that anti-Semitism doesn't still exist, and I'm not naive enough to think that there are still many Jew haters in the community, but it's a different atmosphere and a different culture altogether. I think we Jews feel unburdened. I think we respect our fellow non-Jews, and I think that we're respected by them. Maybe it's a little too much to ask to be loved by them, but as long as we have their respect and as long as we have justice, why, that's all we can ask for. I have never regretted my choice of coming back to Muncie. I've always been thankful I made that choice. And to be perfectly honest with you, I'm very proud of Muncie. I'm very proud of Muncie. I'm very proud of the changes that have been made in Muncie. I'm very proud of the acceptance of all minorities that I've seen develop in Muncie. We have a very poor political climate, but I think there's hope there too. And I really feel that as far as being a Jew in America and a citizen of the United States, I think Muncie is as fine a place to live as a Jew and an American as any place in the entire continent.
Thank you very much. That's very well put, Sherman. This has been Warren Vanderhill speaking with Sherman Zeigler as part of the Muncie Jewish Oral History Project.